But very quickly, there is Hispaniensis, which means, as it says here, Spanish. Now, of course, Spanish might be a little deceptive in the sense that in this specific time, we're talking about the whole Iberian Peninsula. Now, in the 5th century BC, the Iberian Peninsula was infiltrated by the Celts, in the sense that there was a reasonable relocation of some Celtic tribes, which not only brought their culture, but also their material culture with them, including swords. In this specific time period, the sword that the Celts were using was called the Latin B, which was a type of relatively longish iron sword that was used mostly for slashing motions. But then these people, together with the local smiths, will create a little bit of a hybrid sword between the swords used by the local populations, indigenous populations, and these swords manufactured by the Celts. And this connection will create the so-called gladius Hispaniensis, which was a mixture between stabbing swords and slashing swords, kind of taking the best of both worlds, if you will. And the Romans, once again, give it its name because of its place of origin, even though, as you can see, the origins are a lot deeper than just saying, well, it's a sword that was made in Spain. You guessed it right. If you're interested in a dedicated video, let me know. So let's do one more.
The concept of the eternal flame is as ancient as it gets. In ancient Roman religion, the sacred flame of Vesta was a sacred eternal flame that was kept burning in the temple of Vesta in the Roman Forum. The flame was guarded by the Vestal Virgins, who were priestesses of Vesta, the Roman goddess of the hearth, home, and family. But let's rewind back further in time, in search for the origins of the myth. The sacral aspect of fire, or rather fire as a deified element, has its roots in the ancestral history of mankind. While Doomzil has proposed an Indo-European origin of the cultic nature of fire, starting from the Vedic deity Agni, who represents the protective and purifying fire which burns demons and acts as an intermediary between man and the gods, with its flame rising upwards to the sky, the deification of fire is actually present more or less incisively in all cultures of the ancient world. It is by learning to master fire that man manages a divine power, a potentially destructive entity that at the same time protects him from ferocious beasts, warms him, and illuminates the darkness. All of these characteristics led the fire of myth to shape itself around its protective and defensive elements at the expense of the destructive ones. In the minds of the ancients, a choice was made.
Hestia eudunatoi kronu tygater basileia, mesonoi konekes pyrosai naoi omegistu.
The Greek deity to whom the flame was consecrated is
Hestia,
whose very name directly recalls the domestic hearth. Theoretically, the hearth of every private home was sacred to Hestia and was her manifestation, but every Greek polis or city also had a public place called
Prytaneion,
which was consecrated to Hestia and preserved her sacred fire, which was never to be extinguished and represented the spirit of the city. Originally, this was supposed to be some sort of royal residence, the seat of the
Britannis,
and in addition to being the meeting place of the most powerful magistrates and the place where the city's fire is kept, it becomes where foreign ambassadors are welcomed and where the most deserving citizens are hosted for some time at the state's expense, to symbolize the origin of a new common civic bond in the new settlement. And it's no coincidence that Vesta has the epithet Iliaca for Ovid, meaning of Ilium, so of Troy. There is a strong mythological and literary connection to the sacred fire of the goddess of the hearth, thus Hestia of Troy, which Aeneas brings with him to Latium, as in fact this goddess, in both traditions, has to be identified with the hearth itself and its fire. For instance, while Ovid evidently attributes its introduction to Aeneas, Dionysius of Halicarnassus links the institution of the cult of the Vestal Virgins to Numa, the second king of Rome. Plutarch, for his part, seems to draw on very different and conflicting origin myths, referring on the one hand to Numa, but then writing that, open quotes, it is said that Romulus was the first to introduce the consecration of fire and appointed the sacred virgins, called Vestals, to preserve it. The fire of Vesta was held in a specific building called Aedes Vestae. Numa, according to the myth, was a Sabine. This could imply a Sabine origin of the cult, which is also suggested by Varro, but probably has its roots in a recurring topos in the Latin literature of origins, according to which the Sabines were a particularly pious people in contact with the gods. Archaeological and literary evidence in fact shows an archaic presence of the cult in purely Latin context, from Alba Longa to Tivoli to Aricia, Lanuvio and to Carsoli. And if a common origin with the cult of Hestia is probable, the cult of Vesta evidently develops autonomously, particularly with the figures of the Vestal Virgins, a purely female priesthood that is absent in the Greek context. A reality we could consider close, but at the same time very different from the cult of the sacred flame in the classical world, is the more ancient worship of fire in the Iranian world. Similarly to the cults of Hestia and Vesta, the veneration of fire within the Zoroastrian religion clearly has its origin in a cult of the domestic hearth. The hearth, providing warmth, light and comfort, was considered by the ancient Indo-Iranian people as the visible incarnation of the divinity Atar, to whom regular offerings were paid, according to a ritual that involved throwing the fat of a sacrificial animal into the fire, letting it melt completely, and thus feeding the flame and making it soar. Strabo reports that the Persians offered, open quotes, sacrifices to the fire by adding dry debarked wood and putting fat on top of Piratheia, consisting of noteworthy sanctuaries with an altar in the center, on which there is a large quantity of embers, and where the Magi keep the fire always burning. Similar to the Greek and Roman worlds, the idea of fire as a representation of the state also seems to be present in the Indo-Iranian world. But since there was never a transition from the monarchical to the republican institution as there was in the classical period, the sacred flames seem to be inextricably linked to the figure of the monarch. Letter of Tansar, a 6th century AD Sassanid document, there is explicit reference to the custom of dynastic fires, which burned perpetually as a manifestation of the authority and continuity of the reigning houses. It is above all a revealing element linked to ordeals and the creation of the archangel Asha Vahishta, literally the supreme truth or justice. And according to the teaching of Zoroaster, the offering made to the fire had to be performed with thought turned to the principle of truth. In Zoroastrian cosmogony, the fire created by Asha permeates all the other 6 creations of the other 6 archangels: men, animals, minerals, earth, water and plants, giving them warmth and consequently the vital spark. The sacred fire of the supreme truth also manifests itself in many visible forms, from the greatest of all, the sun that orders day and night and controls the seasons, to domestic and ritual fires, and also the revealing fire of the judicial ordeal, prototype of the torrent of fire of the day of judgment. I wish to read now the words of Alexander the Great as reported by Diodorus Siculus, which he spake at the death of Hephaestion. He ordered all the inhabitants of Asia should extinguish those fires that the Persians called sacred.
But for now, I think that's what I wanted to discuss today. And if you appreciated this video, please let me know in the comments below. And remember, thumbs up. And if you're yet not a member of this community, become a noble one. Subscribe to my channel for more content from the Metatron. And remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.